Hi, welcome to our next lecture for Arch15b. We're going to be talking today about the Beaux-Arts movement, and specifically in terms of geography, the beginnings of the Beaux-Arts movement, the reaching its sort of high point, and then the precipice of the Beaux-Arts movement being exported to the United States and the taking like wildfire of the Beaux-Arts movement here in the United States, which will also lead to the City Beautiful movement, um, and a really exciting time in American history, generally in American history, where architecture, I would say, is the center of a very important event in our history, which is the World's Columbian Exposition, the Chicago World's Fair. So we'll get to that towards the end of our lecture today. And I want to jump right in and introduce the Beaux-Arts movement. Beaux-Arts is spelled B-E-A-U-X. It's a French word. Beaux Arts. It's hyphenated. Beaux Arts. Beaux hyphen ARTS. The direct translation is the fine arts. So the Beaux Arts movement has a number of unique things about it. I would say if you've read chapter 16, you probably have gotten this impression, which is that there are probably two main components to the Beaux-Arts movement, at a fundamental level, which make it important to study. It's the first time in the history of world architecture let me back up. So in early Renaissance, there was an interest in humanism, and so that drove a lot of the ideals, a lot of the work of Alberti, Brunelleschi, a lot of the work that was being done in northern Italy, central Italy, and throughout was this renewed interest in human life and civic life. Remember the Palazzo Vecchio, for example, and this interest in giving spaces that serve the common folk rather than just the royalty. So there was an interest in human life and humanism. In the late Renaissance, I would say the church or the papacy became really the driving force of a lot of the masterworks of architecture of that time period. In the Protestant Reformation, I guess you could say it was religion, but a renewed interest or a redefinition of religion with Martin Luther's 95 Theses, and in this express intent and emphasis on purification and whitewashing and reduction, simplification, minimalism, really would be a good way to describe it. So in large part, that drove. So I guess you could say in the latter two, theology was at the core. And the first one, human life or the human experience was at the core. In the Baroque, it was geometry and technique, and really this period of exploration in new methods of geometry and construction technique. New shapes, new forms were starting to be developed. So really mathematics and geometry kind of were at the center of what was driving a lot of the architecture work being produced. In the neoclassical, which we just learned about, there's a return to classical proportions, classical ideas, classical shapes. And so there's this, I guess you could say, history then is really the focal point. So with the Beaux-Arts is actually the École des Beaux-Arts, which is the building that you're looking at here, is a school. It's not unlike, in fact, it's the reemergence of the Royal Academy, which you may remember from the prior lecture on the neoclassical work, started to emerge as the first kind of major school for dedicated to architectural learning. It goes away with the French Revolution and then basically comes back as the École des Beaux-Arts. The Royal Academy didn't have nearly the power that the École des Beaux-Arts does, in that basically for the next 150 years, the best of the best from around the world really come to the École, train at the École, and then oftentimes return back to where they came, and take the ideals that they learned in school here, to their various parts of the world. So, what were the things that they were learning? What the Beaux-Arts movement endeavored to do more so than anything else was the book uses the term eclectic, and people use the term eclectic to describe the Beaux-Arts. In fact, there's a lot of fantastic Beaux-Arts buildings here in Fresno. If you've had the opportunity to, or have the opportunity to, spend some time on the Fulton Mall and text me or email me, and I can give you some specific buildings to look at up and down the Fulton Mall that have really exquisite examples of Beaux-Arts architecture. What the Beaux-Arts attempted to do, it's I guess its core ideal, was that it respected the architectural styles of the past in their varying forms and understood that there were good things from all prior architectural eras. And it attempted to synthesize the best from all. So the proportionality from one, the materiality from another, the discipline and the form generating emphasis of another, the roof form or the construction technique of another. It recognized high points from any of the prior 400, 500, 600 years of architectural legacy and attempted to basically bring them all together and bring the best of them all together. The book has a fantastic quote by Julien Gaudet, 1834 to 1908. I believe the book described I described it as her, so I think she may have been although that would have been out of the ordinary for there to have been a female instructor at the école. So maybe it was a male. The reason I say that is because I know the école was exclusively a male school until probably the early 20th century. And I know that because Julia Morgan, who is one of the greatest architects in the history of American architects, if not world architects, and I won't qualify it any further than that, but a woman herself, was the first woman. She studied at Berkeley as an undergrad, I believe, and then was the first woman to be accepted at the École ever. And that would have been, I want to say, the very, very end of the 19th century, 1898, 1899, may have even been the very beginning of the 20th century. It could have been like 1903, 1904. But right around that time frame, I know she was basically the first woman to study at the École. In the time since, obviously things have gotten a lot better from that standpoint. But Julien Gaudet's birth date is 1834, and she passed in 1908. So anyway, may or may, I'm not sure whether Julien is a male or a female name in French, but nonetheless has a fantastic quote, which goes like this, and it's in the book in chapter 16. And I think it summarizes what the Beaux-Arts movement was trying to do. Everything which has remained victorious in the struggle of the arts, everything that continues to arouse universal admiration, is what summarizes or comprises the Beaux-Arts movement. So again, it's this interest in taking the best from all prior things and combining them into this one mega architectural endeavor. But you can also imagine why that would lead to some people describing it as eclectic, which is basically sort of a kitsch or a sort of unharmonious amalgamation or a combination of multiple things together, tends to be described as having eclectic quality. Nonetheless, that is the Beaux-Arts movement. So the École, this school, started in 1819 in France, and the book describes the pedagogical um, basis for the school being founded in really two main ideas, or the school became defined by its uniqueness, its distinction was two key elements which other architectural schools, polytechnic schools prior to, were not putting into practice. And that is the use of the partie, which I'm going to explain and show you a couple of examples here in a minute. But the partie is basically an initial idea or a diagram. Could be a very simple diagram, sketch, or drawing, but it's the diagram or the concept that organizes the project from its inception. So it's the like if you think back to if we think back to Louis Michel Thibault from the middle of the 18th century, you'll remember his emphasis on the use of the grid, the superimposition of the grid, both on masterworks from the prior area as he went back to kind of study them and understand what the architects were doing in terms of overlaying a grid system over their plans and sections and sometimes elevations. The grid in Louis Michel's case really became the generator of the design. Well, in the École des Beaux-Arts, the partie, or the simple organizing diagram, becomes the generator of the design. So that, the use of the partie, and also the method of running the studio as an atelier, which is in effect a studio. And the Beaux-Arts model for the atelier was that it paired up fifth or sixth year students with first or second year students. So there was always this kind of new learner being paired with a more experienced learner, the two kind of helping each other propel a project forward that was always exclusively led by the older student, who oftentimes was competing to win the Rome Prize. And so that led to kind of a more collaborative, open studio model. So the notion of the atelier and the use of the partie. Here's a good example of a partie. So this is the Alexandria Library, which was a competition won by Craig Dykers and his colleagues, his four colleagues. I believe there were five graduate students at the time who won the international competition to design the Library of Alexandria in Egypt. The Library of Alexandria is a historic library, was known as the most robust, richest library in terms of its collections in world history. Had I don't know the story of how it stopped being, but the Library of Alexandria was no longer, and the Egyptian government about 30 years ago sought to build a new and restore the notion of the Alexandria Library as being this prominent world force in library library collections. So they launched this competition. The Snøhetta team, as it would later be called, won the competition against some other really high quality corporate firms. And that's a story unto itself, and I won't get deep into that story. But this was essentially their partie diagram that became the organizing principle, the organizing idea that led to the development and the refinement and then ultimately the construction of their project, which is the Alexandria Library. This is the ground plane, And this is basically the building volume above ground and the building volume below ground. And the notion is that they wanted to basically take the idea of the ground plane, rotate it about a midpoint, and actually create volume on either side. A simple, really unintelligent and unsophisticated sketch, nonetheless a strong partie that drove the concept all the way through, from conceptual design through to development of the project and ultimately into construction. These are some pictures of it. So you're actually looking at that plane. So this would be the sort of rotation point of that plane. This would be the volume above ground that you're seeing in the background, and then the volume below ground that we're seeing in the foreground, with a long processional from what I believe would be the south of the library. North is facing that way. Here are some sections, beautiful section drawings showing the kind of quality of the space. Not sure what happens here. Something important that I should probably know takes place in this element. But effectively, these are the book stacks and the reading areas that sort of tear back and follow in parallel plane, the sloped plane that was defined by really this original sketch. That's that plane there. So that's an example of partie. Oh, actually, so this is actually from one of my projects. This is the Armenian Genocide Monument at Fresno State. Some of you may have seen it. It's on campus at the intersection of the Rose Walk and the Maple Mall, sort of towards the east end of campus. In this case, it's a monument dedicated to not only the Armenian Genocide, primarily the Armenian Genocide, but also genocides against all humanity throughout the 20th century, starting from 1901 all the way through 1999, and the Armenian Genocide happened in 1915. And so the monument is dedicated to the 1.5 million victims of the Armenian Genocide. And there is a similar monument in the capital of Armenia, Yerevan. And so there's basically a study of that monument in a flattened plane. So this would be a plan view looking, basically a bird's eye view, I suppose, looking down and then taking that idea and collapsing the ground plane. So in the Yerevan version of the monument, you actually approach on ground level and then go down maybe 7 or 8 risers, so probably about 4 or 5 feet perhaps, to a lower ground plane where there's actually like an eternal flame in the center. And these things are tilted inwards to create this interesting volume with these slots, which is where the risers are, the steps are that take you down. So it's basically solid with the only openings being the void spaces where the stairs are. So there are these inward leaning obelisks. So in step 2, we basically flatten the ground plane. So we took the monument study, basically made it a figure ground diagram, and then flattened that to take away the notion of the lowering down. There were accessibility issues. The scale of ours is not the same as the scale of this one in Yerevan. So we went away from that idea of going up or down from ground plane. So we basically flattened it in diagram 3. And then in diagram 4, we basically invert. So where void is here becomes solid in our design, and where solid is here becomes void in our design. And that partie basically became the driver for the design. We arranged a series of pillars around that radius. This is actually a section study of the existing monument that was the basis where we started our work. This is the name of it, the Zizernagapert monument. So that effectively became, this plan, and then a series of other diagrams. It's an elevation study, and then the thing was built. And so you can kind of see that partie diagram driving not only the ideation, the conceptual design, but also the development of the production drawings, and then ultimately the construction work. Okay, so that's partie. The belief of this school, the Beaux-Arts, in addition to being an atelier system and emphasizing the importance of the partie or the organizing diagram, the belief in this school was that a proper education certainly began with the classics. So there's that consistency and that theme that's repeated itself several times now in the, gosh, how many years have we studied so far? Almost 500 years that we've been covering. That's a common theme, that the classics are important. Um, so studying the Pantheon, studying the Parthenon is important. But what was also important and emphasized is other non-classical architectural works of the past. The Hagia Sophia, so studying Byzantine architecture, Chartres Cathedral, so studying High Gothic and Romanesque. Which is consistent with the first point I made, which is that the Beaux-Arts endeavored to basically take the best from all prior, so that it would be no surprise that they believe that a proper education began with the study in the classics, but also evolved into studying other masterworks of architecture. Felix Dubon is one of the first sort of luminary educators and architects from the École. Felix Dubon, D-U-B-A-N, lived 1797 to 1870. In 1832, he kind of started to really sort of systematically and in a passioned way started to rebuild the École. He actually helped build the École building using ashlar base. So there's rustication here at the ground plane, something we've seen many times before. Refined, so the facade stone is refined at the upper levels. Not a new theme here. We've seen that before. The interior courtyard, which is probably the most memorable of Dubon's contributions at the École, was prior an open courtyard, no roof over it. And he brought in to this space the iron columns that support the iron bond beam that makes up the rim or the perimeter of this glass roof enclosure, which continues to introduce or allow natural light to come into the courtyard space, but actually gives it a semi-private quality in that it's basically protected from the weather, but has the benefit of having some of the beautiful sunlight quality that even you see in this image. The thing I like about Dubon's work here is, there's the practical nature of being able to put a structure like this of glass and iron, which weighs quite a bit, and distribute the loads into the edges and the basically roof line or the fascia line that surrounds, which he resolved by basically introducing, a beam that is supported at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so on and so forth points that brings the load from the upper section down through those 7 or 8 points across the run. So there's that. The thing I like most about it is that it also says a lot about what was happening at the time. So we studied a little bit in the prior lecture, and we kind of finish in this lecture with bringing to the fore the idea of the Industrial Revolution that has taken place. We now have the ability to mass produce. We can work in different materials like iron, like we can make steel. And so there's, you can see Dubon and the architects of the time bringing the most emergent technology into their architectural work. Exposed iron supports I talked about. The slender columns and the billowing dome is a good characteristic term the book used. Okay, another high point in the Beaux-Arts is this space, which is Bibliothèque Nationale. Bibliothèque, those of you who are Spanish speakers know already that means library. National means national. This is in Paris, 1865. And this is Dubon's close friend, Henry Labrouste, Henry Labrouste, Henry Labrouste, 1801 to 1875. Again, thin, slender supports. You can see them here, the paired columns that are supporting the arches. that are basically radiating around the exterior. So even, formally, this is quite unique. We've seen circles superimposed within squares, which makes it, from a practical standpoint, a little bit easier to build. We've certainly seen circle domes on top of square bases. We've seen circle tholobates resolved over rectangular and square base levels, whether it's a basilica or it's a cruciform plan. But not often have we seen a true kind of a rotunda building, really, since probably the Parthenon. Um, oh, and the oculus around the radius of the dome, and then the central large oculus at the top are some of the character defining images. Floral like stems. So there, these, you can actually get a much better view from this slide. So you see the tall, slender iron columns and the supports, and what look like stems that may be supporting flowers or branches above. So this idea, really, I would say, for the first time, maybe arguably in the Baroque, but I think more clearly with the Beaux-Arts, this notion that we talk about today, and a lot of the contemporary work that we do and see, we talk about the notion of biomimicry, mimicking biology, or mimicking human, not human nature, but the living world, plants, animals, organisms. We see beautiful patterns in nature over and over again, and oftentimes architects look to evoke that in their architectural work. We call that biomimicry, mimicking life, different life forms, whether they're plant or animal or whatnot. So I would say you see that really for the first time here with Bibliothèque Nationale. Okay, moving to the Palais des Beaux-Arts, PALAIDEBAUXARTS. This is 1885 in Lilliers, France. And this is Edouard Berard, EDOUARD, BERARD, 1843 to 1912. The book, the reason the book finds this a noteworthy example, and I agree, and that's why I've picked it out as part of the slides to show you, is because this, I think, more than any other project that I show today, embodies the notion of the Beaux-Arts trying to combine the best from all. You can see the sort of, how do I want to say this? I don't want to give it a negative connotation. I would say perhaps the density of ideas. There's a lot going on. The edicula, or the edicules, which are the was one of your vocabulary terms from the last section. The horizontal projection that basically extends a cover over the over an entry or the entry, is really being borrowed from the Baroque. The again, the rusticated base that's different from the sort of refined upper section, what look like to be Corinthian columns, statuary, mansard roofs. These are all coming from different eras of architecture. The lantern, which looks to be maybe high Renaissance, could be Baroque. Certainly some Gothic detailing here. Maybe some Rococo detailing with the coins, or the quatrefoils, the decorative elements here on the facade that point, that are really on top of the voussoirs at the center of the arches here. The pediments, clear classical references. So there's a lot going on. It's not that it makes the building bad in any way, shape, or form. It looks like a magnificent building, in my opinion. But it's definitely drawing from lots of different places, and not one or two places. It's getting its ideas from from several. And that, I think, is really the best example of what the Beaux-Arts was trying to do. Here's another example, drawing maybe from the Byzantine ideas, the ablak pattern, the polychromatic marble motif that we've seen a few times already, being mixed in with some classical ideas, the biforum windows, the paired columns, the standard arch, the dome, the tholobate, maybe even some Islamic elements, which, maybe a reference to, well, you could say this has Russian architectural origins or Islamic origins. We've seen examples from both. And this is Santa Maria Maggiore, Marie Majeure. This is in Marseille, France, built 1852 to 1893, and the architect is Léon Vadomer. Leon, Leon Vaudomer, lived 1803 to 1872. Polychrome ablak, Gothic rose window. I forgot to point out the Gothic rose windows there around the dome. The Renaissance dome, we talked about the rustication at the base. There's another image of Santa Maria Maggiore in Marseille. Shifting to the last example of Beaux-Arts work in Europe. So we're now at the middle to end of the 19th century. But the Beaux-Arts has become very, very popular throughout Europe by this point, and really for the next 15 or 20 years. And this example is the Vittoriano, as it's remembered or called in Italy, and it's a monument to Victor Emmanuel. Was built 1861 to 1878 in Rome. They also refer to it as the Monumento Nazionale. And the architect is Giuseppe Sacconi, Giussippe, Sacconi, Giuseppe Sacconi, who lived 1854 to 1905. And this is being done as, first of all, a grand gesture dedicated to a very important man in Italian history, Italian military history. It's also set directly in front of Michelangelo's Campidoglio. So it's a very important site. And so something small and equal in proportion, as Sacconi thought, would not be the right approach, and something grand, something larger, something that transcends the scale of Campidoglio was necessary here. And therefore, he built something that's maybe 3 or 4 times the scale. A lot of reduction. So there's a lot of, I think, similarity I see architecturally in St. Paul's Cathedral, that I see in Vittoriano, that I see in our U.S. Capitol building. So it's lots of detail, lots of relief, lots of kind of playfulness, of portico, of intercolumniation, of pediment, entablature. I mean, look at this entablature up here, or the entire frieze, and the amount of detailing that's there. There's quite a bit going on. There's lots of different materials being mixed, but white is primarily the only color that we're seeing on this facade, which I think is common to St. Paul's Cathedral as well as to our U.S. Capitol. This is also commonly referred to as the wedding cake because of the sort of tiering, express tiering that it has. 128-foot wide stairway. So that's this stairway we're looking at here, a really, really grand stairway to really approach this upper terrace, which has 3 sections, which then allows you to go around and continue to move up. And this is all done in Brescia marble, which is white marble. Prescia must be the place in Italy where it comes from. I don't know, because I know Carrara marble and other kinds of marble usually are associated with where the quarry is or where it's refined from. I'm imagining Brescia as a location, but it's Brescia marble. Okay. So all of this leads to, because Americans are coming and going, and because America has established itself in large part from the English, who were European, reference to classical proportions and classical architecture. I guess I had maybe multiple slides of the Vittoriani. Okay, so here we get to America. So because there's a lot of Americans that have helped start the country, who are continuing to build the country, still going back and forth and paying attention to what's happening in Europe, and America is this really large experiment of creating something but something unique, unique from Europe. It's struggling to, at the same time, continue some of the quality and stylistic things that have been established by the Beaux-Arts and other prior eras, but also distinguish itself and make itself something unique, like America, the project, is unique. And so it really begins the book actually uses the title The American Renaissance, really referring to an architectural renaissance, a rebirth, in which the Beaux-Arts lands and prominently becomes the sort of style of choice for the first probably 100 years, starting from the late 19th century, I would say the middle of the 19th century into the early part of the 20th century, which will bring us to the precipice of early modernism, which I will lecture on next week. There will be one more lecture on the Met Museum, which is a high work of Beaux-Arts in America. I think it's one of the most important projects we've built in this country. And so there will be one lecture. It will be a short lecture, maybe 30 to 35-minute lecture, only on the Met, and that will close us out with the Beaux-Arts. And then we basically begin with the early part of the 20th century with the start of modernism in the United States. So this is really starting from the mid-19th century up until that point. Beaux-Arts is the sort of go-to style. So yeah, into the 19th century. By the way, America was producing a third of the world's industrial output. And so as the Beaux-Arts was running its course in Europe, and economically, Europe wasn't thriving to the same degree that the United States was. America really picks up the baton with fervor of the Beaux-Arts. Okay, so this is a good example of kind of early experimentation. This is Richard Morris Hunt, who also is the architect that we're going to talk about in the next lecture when we look exclusively at the Met Museum. Richard Morris Hunt lived 1827 to 1895, and he was really the first école-trained architect in the United States. He established an office in the United States, which his office practice was based on the educational model of the Beaux-Arts. So he had an office that he called an atelier, which was mimicking the model that he had learned in at the École des Beaux-Arts. He had actually also worked while he was in Paris, and after graduating, before coming back to the United States, had worked under the architect Lefouel on the Louvre. So many of you know the Louvre Museum for IMP's pyramid entry that's set in the middle of the courtyard of the Louvre. But the Louvre is a breathtaking work of architecture in and of itself, even prior to IMP's sort of flanking of the entryway at the center of the courtyard. And so Morris Hunt got to work on the Louvre project before coming back to the United States. Did extensive work in New York, later did the Met Museum, as we're going to study, did the base of the Statue of Liberty that the statue sits upon. But here we're looking at the Biltmore Estate. So this is 1895. And again, you see a lot of what you saw with this project, which is in Marseille. So it's trying to take the best from a lot of different things. And the resultant is maybe not something harmonious or muted or reserved. Rather, it's a little bit, I think dense was the word I used. And that's kind of what's coming to mind again. There's a lot of ideas being represented here. Nonetheless, one of Richard Morris Hunt's examples of his transplanting the école, the Beaux-Arts ideas and making them unique and American. I would say the first effort to kind of break away, to take the Beaux-Arts ideals, but make something unique here in America from those ideals is this example, which is the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, built in 1876 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This is architect Frank Furness, lived 1839 to 1912, who worked for Richard Morris Hunt for a while, and attempted to basically forge his own independent style using some of the training that he had under Morris Hunt. Also did a building for the Centennial Exposition. Oh, I'm sorry. This building was completed for the Centennial Exposition of 1876, which is basically marking 100 years of America, and showing now what unique, fine, amazing things America can do on its own from what it has seen from the rest of the world. You can see kind of uncharacteristic or unique things. The stout columns, even the central disc or the banding of the stout columns, almost to suggest that he recognizes that like 1 to 10 or 1 to 20 is the more classical proportion of the column, and he's not using a 1 to 10 proportion. So it's almost like he's telling us that he understands that he's really cut the column and he's stitched it back together with the stout columns. The granite porch, this detailing, I would say, follows it's unique and it's similar. It's similar in the sense that it still has a rusticated, rough, unrefined quality. So it's similar in that sense, but it's unique in the sense that the patterning he's using in I doubt that's cast concrete. That must be stonework. So I would say the chiseling in that stonework has a different rusticated quality from what we've typically seen, which is that the field is generally smooth or smoother, and really it's the perimeter edges that have that rusticated quality. This isn't that. This is different. He's doing kind of like a pocking of the stone elements at the base, but still giving it kind of a rusticated, more rough quality relative to some of the brick and the masonry that we see overhead. Doric entablature. So I think that's referring to. It's hard to call those Doric. It must be referring to this, but even this, I don't think can be indexed within sort of classical orders of Doric or Ionic Corinthian. The book calls it Doric. But I would say even here it's uniquely American, and it's unique to Furness, the architect here. The outsize metope, so this in the entire kind of upper section being really broader, really having a kind of a taller forehead, if you will. And then the use of iron beams, which actually you don't see in this image, but you see around the side. And then the interior quality, the pointed arches. And even here, there's the notion, there's like the remnant of what looks like it may have started as a pointed arch, and it may be scaled up so much that we're looking at really only the upper section, which has been widened slightly. But nonetheless, it's unique. It's something that doesn't have precedent in prior architectural styles, and so it's the architect creating something unique here. Okay, Pennsylvania Fine Art. So moving along, there's a nice night shot of the Pennsylvania. Moving on to the Trinity Church, Boston, another important early American architect, Henry Hobson Richardson, H.H. Richardson, 1838 to 1886. This is Boston. Trinity Church, again, I would say a really good example of experimentation. It's the architect trying to discover new things and figuring things out and resolving it, or at least testing those ideas out in built form here with Trinity Church, but H.H. Richardson again is taking elements from lots of different architectural styles. You see a little bit of the remnants of the polychromatic, although it's not so consistent, dark white, dark white, dark white, dark white, but he's kind of breaking that up and doing something unique with it. The sort of tiered archway, which is starting here, pulling towards us incrementally, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, probably 7 layers. Not a lot, not 3 or 4 feet of a 3 or 4 foot difference, but certainly kind of building that up. So we can even say that has basis in the Vittoriano and the notion of layering. We see Gothic elements. You see the kind of witch's cap here, the turrets, which you can pin back down to Islamic architecture, and then even some classical references with the biforum windows, the triple biforum windows here, the pilasters, the columns, the arched openings. So lots of different stylistic things coming together to make H.H. Richardson's architecture here. And even the interior quality, again, some similarities, but the sort of profiling of the opening here, I would say, is quite unique, is quite interesting, in my opinion. Not something that we've seen lots of. I mean, we've seen the basilica form, and that's what this seems to be, kind of a long linear rectangular hall flanked by a dome. But the sectional quality of that, I would say, has certainly some unique characteristics. The Tribune Building in New York, also Richard Morris Hunt, 1875, one of the first real high-rise buildings or mid-rise buildings built in the United States, built in the Beaux-Arts tradition, is another really good example. That's in New York. Okay, all of this to lead to this sort of kind of magic moment of the Columbian Exposition of 1893, otherwise known as the Chicago World's Fair. So the World's Fairs, I think they still happen, although they're not nearly as popular as they used to be in the 19th and 20th centuries. To give you an example of the World's Fair, like the Eiffel Tower was built in Paris, was built for the World's Fair, I think 2 or 3 fairs prior to this. I want to say maybe the 1891 World's Fair, which at that time was obviously in Paris. Gustave Eiffel wants to, it understands, and the Parisian government and the people who put on the exposition know that people are going to come to the World's Fair from around the world. And so what they want to see, first of all, is what is the world up to? But second, want to display what great things the host country is doing in the arts, in music, in the fine arts, as well as the craft arts, in agriculture, in engineering, in technology, in architecture. And so to display the fine kind of engineering work and the construction sophistication of the French in the end of the 20th century, really to show off the Industrial Revolution, Gustave Eiffel envisages the notion of building the Eiffel Tower. They build the Eiffel Tower. It's actually a hated thing for the first 10 or 20 years. And then, can you imagine Paris or France without the Eiffel Tower now? They're sort of inseparable. It's become the sort of image of the country, or the icon for the monument of the country to a large degree. So those are the kinds of things that happen at World's Fair. So America is no different. America wants to prove to the world what a great place this is, what a great country has been founded here. And so for the World's Columbian Exposition, the 1893 World's Fair, Chicago is the host city, and it really wants to impress the world more so than any World's Fair has ever impressed its visitors. And it's just this magic moment where there isn't a lot of fighting happening. So people are able to travel, get on a ship for however many weeks it takes to cross over the Atlantic, and visit Chicago and visit America. But also, obviously, there's a lot of curiosity with this thing called America that's been going on for about 100 years and seems to be coming into its own as a world power. So people are curious about America. People haven't visited America, so they take this as an opportunity to visit. And what they do for the World's Fair is they basically decide they're going to use architecture to impress the world with how great America is. And really, this starts the City Beautiful movement, this idea of a carefully, thoughtfully organized, planned city or campus, if you will, becomes the fascination of cities across the United States. And so that launches the City Beautiful movement, where cities are starting to try and look like what the campus or the city, the small city that was for the World's Fair built, felt like and looked like. And I think it had record attendance. There's actually a really good book, if any of you are interested. It's a partial, I guess it's technically a nonfiction book, but there's a lot of, it's a fiction book, but there are a lot of non-fictional elements in it. It's by Eric Larson. It's called The Devil in the White City. It's this parallel story of telling about the greatness of the Chicago World's Fair and Daniel Burnham and Adler and Sullivan and all the amazing architects that come together, which we're going to see in the next few slides here, to create this wonderful architectural experience for the 2 or 3 months that the exposition is up. But also there's a couple of prominent murders that take place. And so the parallel story is actually a story of, I think, like a serial killer of a murder. I think what does he do? He's a serial killer of some sort. So it's kind of like time lapses back and forth between that sort of extreme thinking back to the sort of extremist thinking that the architects had to have in order to make the white city come to be. So it's this kind of like two ends of the spectrum of what kind of extremism sometimes produces, sometimes good, sometimes excessive bad. So it's a really good book. I read it, I don't know, maybe 10 or so years ago, I think, when it came out. But if you're interested in that kind of thing, it's a good read. It's a short read too. So Devil in the White City. Okay, Chicago World's Fair, 1893. The major characters, I'm going to name the architects. I'm not going to spell them all because they'll continue to come up over the next this lecture and the next lecture. John Root from William and Root, Daniel Burnham, Frederick Law Olmsted, Charles Atwood, Richard Morris Hunt, McKim, Mead, and White, which is our three different architects that form the firm McKim, Mead, and White, Adler and Sullivan, which is a firm of I can't remember Adler's first name, but Louis Sullivan is the partner, the Sullivan partner, and then Adler, and Harry Cobb. So this collection of who's who of the best American architects at the time are being summoned here and paid to design and build some of the most amazing buildings of the Chicago World's Fair. And the intent with the buildings of the World's Fair, so there's the Ferris wheel that is also invented at the 1893 World's Fair. So we're trying to kind of out Eiffel Tower. And so this is kind of our version of that industrial revolution engineering experiment. The intent of the buildings at the World's Fair is that they're ephemeral buildings. They're not intended to be permanent buildings. Well, this thing was such a powerful and impactful experience that they tried to keep as many of the buildings as possible. And unfortunately, there was a big fire in Chicago. Some of the buildings were lost. Some of them would the real estate was just prime real estate, and so they need to take them down to utilize that space for other things. I think there's only one or two buildings that actually have been able to successfully be preserved from the 1893 World's Fair. But the idea is not that any of these buildings stay up for a long time. Is that they're built to show something for a while, and then after a few months, they basically get taken down, and the world waits for the next World's Fair, wherever that happens to be. So the three things that we're going to talk about, the three major works from the Chicago World's Fair, is this building, which is the admin building, Richard Morris Hunt. We're going to talk about Lou Sullivan's remarkable transportation building. Again, I know I say this a lot, but another one of my favorite American architectural projects. And then the agricultural building done by it was Charles McKim from McKim Mead and White. Okay, so let's start with the admin building. This is I think I have a map. Thought I included that's the Met. Okay, I didn't. You can look up. Yeah, let's do it here. Just a moment. Okay, so this is a good example of the sort of campus that was built as part of the Chicago World's Fair. All of these, really, that you're seeing in the foreground around the lakeshore were all buildings built for the World's Fair. That's the admin building that we're going to look at. This is the transportation building that we're going to see. And I actually don't know where the agriculture building is, but that's definitely the admin building that we're going to look at first. Okay, so there's the admin building. And it's really central in that there's the sort of large water feature built in front of it with the statue looking upon it. And it's really kind of the entry piece, or it's the main piece of the World's Fair. So the architect of the admin building, as I mentioned, so this is 1893, built in 1893. Obviously, that's when the World's Fair was. The architect is Richard Morris Hunt. There's a lot of unique things here. Octagonal dome, not something that we haven't seen, but really in this kind of presence and manner, I would say is a very unique thing. Octagonal dome with a kind of a broad, wide statuary, I should say, up above and then again down below. In plan, the octagon sits inside of a square, basically of 1-to-1 proportion, length to width. But then jutting out from the sort of corners of the square are these 4 pavilions, terraces, as the book calls them, which I think is a unique move of taking the square and then taking the corners of the square and expressing them a little bit more broadly with the corner terraces. Really an ornamental, detailed balustrade up above. And then the Doric elevated portico. So the portico up here really is elevated from the ground plane. We're used to seeing that portico really down on the ground plane. So the notion of the elevated portico up here is something definitely unique that Morris Hunt is giving us with the admin building. 200. So the square is 260 feet by 260 feet to give you a sense of the scale here. You get a better sense of the terraces here. So these are projecting out past the facade, and then this is the upper portico. So we've seen this down on the ground plane quite a bit, starting with Michelangelo, but really this is the first time that somebody's taking that portico and basically lifting it up 3 or 4 stories and putting it at the midsection. And then the way he kind of expresses these balustrades or the parapet, it gives the effect that the octagonal dome is actually piercing the plane of the roof, which I think is an interesting quality here. Okay, that's the admin building. Next is the transportation building. Transportation building really is the only non-white building. And that's, by the way, the book title Devil in the White City. That's where it gets its name because, again, a lot of the work in the Beaux-Arts, definitely for the Chicago World's Fair, there was a sort of whitewashing of all the architectural work there. So this is really the only thing that doesn't follow that all white kind of motif or presentation. The golden doors, again, I talked about this in a prior project. I pointed this out, and I promise you'd see a good example of it when we get to Sullivan. And this is it, where you see the sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 concentric layers that are actually building out from the entry plane of the facade out to this facade. And actually, as I look at this now, it's hard to not remember the mukarnas of Esfahan, and also even in Islamic architecture, of the notion of basically um, surrounding a square around an entry. Pishtak was that the vocabulary term? But basically, the square around the entrance, and then the pulling out, so kind of curving upward and outward from the entry. I'm sort of seeing that in Sullivan's work here for the first time. Whether he was paying attention to that architecture or not, I can't say. I haven't read that anywhere, but just kind of a thought as I'm looking at this and doing a little bit of a closer read. Okay, and the final building, the agricultural building. This is Charles McKim. Oh, and it flanks the admin building. So in that map that we looked at earlier, must have been the building immediately to the left of the admin building. Let's see, flanks the building, glass dome. So there's this kind of interesting glass dome, which doesn't have the same proportion or the same arch, if you will, or the same radius of the dome. It's a flatter presentation of that dome, but interesting nonetheless. Corinthian portico. So we have this portico here, which is done using the Corinthian order, a clear homage to classical antiquity. And the concentric lattice arches, I think, are referring to these arches. And this building actually featured 8 elevators, which is another very unique thing. This is a perfect example of the terrace. It really gives you a very clean view of the terraces of the Morris Hunt's admin building. There's a nice sketch of the same building. And there's a view kind of pulled back a little bit where you see, so that's the building that we were just looking at, the agricultural building, I should say. Okay, and I am going to end. There's a really fine view of the transportation building, Sullivan's transportation building. Okay, I'm going to end there, and we're going to pick up with the next lecture with the Met Museum, Richard Morris Hunt's Met Museum in New York, which is really going to end our learning on the Beaux-Arts, and you will be ready for your Beaux-Arts exam after you've watched this lecture and that forthcoming lecture. So look for that in the next day or so.